Thank you for tuning in to the Practical Preservation Podcast. Please take a moment to visit our website, practicalpreservationservices.com, for additional information and tips to help you restore your historical home. If you've not done so, please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, and also like us on Facebook. Welcome to the Practical Preservation Podcast, hosted by Danielle and Jonathan Kepperling. Kepperling Preservation Services is a family-owned business based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, dedicated to the preservation of our built architectural history for today's use as well as future generations. Our weekly podcast provides you with expert advice specific to the unique needs of renovating a historic home, educating by sharing our From the Trenches preservation knowledge and our guests' expertise, balancing modern needs while maintaining the historical significance, character, and beauty of your period home.
Thank you for joining the Practical Preservation Podcast. Today we have Joe McCormick with us. So Joe, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get started in real estate?
Well, I always open with, I've been living in homes my whole life, so that's where my interest starts. But I've always been into sales. As a teenager, I sold bikes and skateboards, and later that became selling cars. And after buying my first home, which was a Victorian townhouse, I really got interested in that aspect of it. And while cars are my hobby, I both race and restore older cars. The car sales thing was, it's more of a one-sided deal. If you came in to buy a car, we could really get along. It'd be a great process. But in the end, I worked for the dealership. So when it came down to the dollars and cents, it was adversarial. My job was to take your money,
right,
and help you make a great decision. When I got involved with real estate, it's a collaborative process. I work for my client, and while I'm involved in a home sale, it's not as much selling as it is my job is to supply the information that my clients need to make the best decision. And the other thing is that, I worked with high-end cars. It was a lot of fun, and some of them have appreciated. But for most of it, the cars were a depreciating asset.
Right, yeah.
So when the next time I saw my clients to buy a car, the one that I'd sold them was used up. And the nice thing about being in real estate for 15 years is I'm now doing transactions with folks that I sold homes to over a decade ago, and their life has changed. As a realtor, we come into people's lives at that crossroads. The family's getting bigger, or the family's getting smaller, or, a job change or something like that. So we're always in the middle of that intersection. And I kind of look at it as we're guiding the traffic, trying to help facilitate. And what I find really rewarding about it is that I've helped positively contribute to, a person or a family's future, in that, I made some recommendations, and with their sound judgment, they acted. And when it comes time to sell or change properties, they've created equity. They've, put themselves in a good position to move forward.
Yeah, it's more of an investment than an asset. Usually, not always, but usually. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it can be. Well, just like we most of us need a car to get around. We all have to live somewhere. So for a certain amount, it's an expense, but it's also an experience in that,
I was closing my balcony door. Sorry, the trash truck was outside. It's Monday morning.
Not a problem. Where we live is part of our experience. And, for the most part, all of us want a nice experience. And I'm kind of that way. I have always gravitated towards older homes because I found them more interesting because they tell a story. I always imagine, my home is a stone colonial farmhouse built around 1810. I've traced the deeds back to 1760 as a contiguous part of land. And from 1760 to the mid 1960s, it was 127 acres. And it was, before being broken up into a subdivision, it most recently was a turkey farm. And so I learned all kinds of neat things about it.
Right. And learning like that connection to people in place and the past, I think, is what connects people to older homes. I don't know if you find that with your clients.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily, I mean, everyone has this romantic idea that George Washington slept here or something like that. So that may not be the case, but lives happened here.
Yes.
And if you're doing some of the work on, some of these older homes yourself, you discover some of that. In my first home, I peeled back old wallpaper and I found a handwritten message from 1910.
Yes.
And when we went to paint, we made a frame and glued it to the wall, where it wasn't painted.
Right,
where that
so people can see it. Yeah.
Simply because, I thought that was interesting. Someone else, who later bought the home may have taken that down and painted over it. That's their choice. But I wanted to preserve the fact that, John Smith or whoever it was there. They didn't leave a name. They just,
right.
Wrote the date, which I, found interesting. In my current home, there is a love message with initials carved into the third floor step. And I even went on Ancestry.com to look through the families that had owned the home to see, and I've identified the son of one of the owners with those initials. However, he didn't marry that person.
Oh, no.
Or so far, I haven't been able to determine that. So the wood carving graffiti lasted much longer than the relationship.
Yes. Well, I the more I learn about history and people, I'm pretty sure people have been the same pretty much for
yes.
forever.
Yes, absolutely.
So, oh goodness. So when someone wants to buy an older home, like, do you have any tips for them? Do you have, is the process different? Like, talk to me about, like, if somebody comes to you and wants to buy an older home, what do you tell them? What do you caution them?
Well, I always make the joke that in my own home, again, it goes back to setting expectations. And, I do a little sort of interview process with folks, regardless of what type of home they're looking at buying, because I want to find out what their priorities are.
Right.
So older home or not, you can buy an older home that someone just spent $1 million restoring, and it's perfect, and it's likely not going to need anything, for the next 10 to 15 years
right.
in terms of heavy ticket items.
Amount of time, yeah.
But really, what their maintenance threshold is. These homes didn't last this long without some sort of maintenance, or they're going to need it. And so really what any buyer needs for, in varying degrees, if you're buying a brand new townhouse, you probably don't need too much knowledge because, it's pretty basic.
Right.
Whereas when you're looking at different eras of older homes, you're going to want to work with someone who understands the difference of what issues may arise, both positive and negative, from
right.
different periods, and be able to point out, okay, well, in this craftsman style home, this was common.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yes, these light fixtures, although they've been painted over, are likely brass underneath, the built-in fixtures
right.
or something
yeah.
like that. So, point out the positives and then look at some of the drawbacks and say, okay, well, this home was built before in-home heating. So there's pipes that pass through the floors, and there's likely a lot that you'd want to do, if it hasn't been done already, insulation-wise or whatever, that can
right. yeah.
help change this idea from it's a drafty old barn to, it was updated with something that was different than what was initially designed. And then, of course, one of the biggest things I run into is older homes that in the 20s and 30s were wired with electricity, and it was using knob and tube.
Right.
And then later on, and fuses, and then later on, a full rewire wasn't done. It was partially done.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
it may have a circuit breaker now, but those circuits were tapped in from older wires rather than running.
That's what happened at our house. The first floor was completely redone. We thought the electric had been upgraded, and then when our second floor ceiling needed to come down because we had water, we were away, and there was 2 tropical storms back to back, and our rubber roof rolled back and flooded the second floor. When our plaster ceiling came down, we discovered knob and tube, and I'm talking to the insurance company. They're like, "Oh, if we had known that, we would have never insured you," but we didn't know because the ceiling had never come down.
And that's a thing that one of the important documents in any real estate transaction in Pennsylvania, it's required that a seller's disclosure is filled out.
Yes.
And oftentimes, a homeowner like yourselves, even professionals that have a higher level of knowledge, well, none of us have X-ray vision,
right?
So we don't know, is that knob and tube, what's behind there. So I try to point out that that's a possibility. Now, buyers can sometimes get, trapped in the headlights, like a deer with, oh, knob and tube's terrible, I got to run away from this house. No, it's a problem. We just have to quantify the cost and what's involved with it. But also, knob and tube left by itself isn't necessarily bad. It's usually the fact that someone was lazy and tapped into that, and now you are running a lot more current through that. Or, as I'm sure you've seen in a lot of construction jobs, somewhere in the 70s usually, so the energy crisis, someone came in and put insulation in, and stuffed it up against there, and now we're creating a hazard. Left to its own devices, it's all right. And then the thing is that, and this sort of blends into the question you had about hiring an agent. They go hand in hand in that, is the agent that you're working with, do they have a Rolodex, or it's an old term, I guess, in their cell phone? Do they have the numbers of qualified technicians and vendors and tradesmen, craftsmen that can handle the sort of maintenance and or construction issues that you're likely to face that are going to be different? You can call anyone to handle electrical work on a new house because you want to add a ceiling fan or do this. But in an older house, there are contractors that won't touch old work.
Right. It's that understanding. And if you bring somebody new and they might have the best intentions, but they don't necessarily, somebody who does new construction, they might not necessarily have the right solution.
Right. And I point out electrical, you may not be able to see it, but this is the dining room for my home. And when we were looking at it, this house didn't get electric until the 1940s.
Okay.
And that's really great because we skipped over knob and tube.
Right.
And when we find our wiring surprises, as we call them, we call it Farmer Bill wiring, because that's who lived here and likely did it.
Right.
This guy was a farmer. He was, graduated high school in 1940 and got married and bought this property as a farmer. And, likely that generation, they didn't hire contractors. They did all the stuff themselves. Yeah. So when they did, and I'm thankful for this to a great extent, everything is surface mounted.
Right. It was easier. Yeah.
Well, cheaper, and they weren't fishing stuff. I like that because it's a lot easier to remove and go back to the original trim. They completely ripped and hacked something up, and it was sort of put back together. Now, subsequent owners, I take issue with some of the trim that they disturbed and everything, but for the most part, it's intact.
Right.
But when, back to the point of buyers, setting the expectations and having the experience to look at it. And, I ask them what's important in their home purchase,
right?
No matter what they're buying. And when folks identify and say, well, I want something with character, what's older, you find out what periods of home, and what are the attributes that make that home genuine and create value. And one of your questions was, regarding older homes and do I gravitate towards them?
Right.
I don't push anyone into them because it is a different, purchase.
Right.
But most times, no one in my 15 years has said, I want to pay too much for a house. Most everyone is looking for a value.
Right.
And when we look at the long term, in my opinion, and I've sort of demonstrated this with different numbers, and everyone's different, but older homes often provide a value in that the way tax assessments are done. Normally, the same square footage and the same lot size of an older home is going to carry an older assessment value rather than new construction.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
And what I'm sure most people have experienced is that very rarely do our municipal and state and county taxes go down.
Right.
They tend to trend up. So if we're starting with a low number,
yeah,
they may go up, but they're going to be pretty steady. And oftentimes, whereas our values in terms of the actual house purchase, they can go up and down, but oftentimes that number is pretty important because we divide the purchase number over 30 years, 360 mortgage payments. We have to look at that tax number and divide it by 12. So it's a very, very impactful number in terms of fitting into someone's budget. And oftentimes, when we look at an older home with a lower assessment, we can provide value. I have 3 acres, and all of my neighbors have 1 acre lots. I have a bigger home than most of my neighbors. I pay lower taxes.
I hadn't thought about it that way. Thank you for sharing that, because it makes sense to me, because you can only they're not going to raise it more than, if you start out low, they're not going to, that makes sense. But then when you have a new construction, they can start out higher.
Correct. The tax assessment in most areas goes by, what the initial transaction dollar amount was. Now, I mean, this is sort of a little bit beyond the scope of what we were once talking about, but you can contest that and everything. And I've helped clients where we've done new construction purchases do that, the initial tax assessment. But it's done by the community and the rateable percentage. And for instance, in Delaware County, because I work in both Delaware and Chester County, a couple years ago, I helped the son of a friend buy a twin home. Gorgeous construction. I mean, really, top quality stuff. But it was a twin that was approaching $500,000.
Right.
If you had an older home across the street, that was $500,000. The tax bill might be $6,500 at most for the same square footage. The initial tax bill on this home was approaching $13,000.
Oh my goodness! Yeah.
So now we fought it. We got it down to just under $9,000. Which was great. And they knew this going in. We did the calculations and everything said, forecast for this. But the first year or two, it's going to be, you're going to have to pay this, and this is what the settlement costs, and you don't get the money back once it's going forward.
Yeah.
So that's an aspect, and I believe in other things. Again, going back to with an older home, what's likely to go wrong likely already has.
Right.
And what you're getting, kind of a thing. And a few years ago, I was working with my uncle, who was an engineer, and in his career, working for Anheuser-Busch, in 40 years, he moved 11 times.
Oh, goodness.
So he always bought the home that was going to sell the quickest because
he didn't know when he was going to have to move again. Right.
So as he retired, he and his wife, instead of, they were always buying the home that they thought someone else would like.
Right.
They wanted to build or buy the home that they loved. And what he realized was all of the good locations, in a given, if you're near a suburban or metropolitan area, likely all of the good pieces of ground have already been built on. Right. In this case, he found a very, very generic home on a great piece of property, and he tore it down to the foundation and rebuilt. Made what he wanted, created what he wanted, which is a very prairie-style Frank Lloyd Wright, influenced home, because he could not find that. And he was very, very knowledgeable in what he wanted. He wanted a backyard with a tree view that faced south-southwest. I can mention that he's an engineer, a naval officer, an MBA, and now that he's retired, his hobby is Ironman, and he's done 24 of them.
Oh my
And
goodness.
he's not yet, he's about to turn 70, so he's slightly OCD type A.
Yes. Just a little.
But it actually, working, with him, because I know him so well, he's my uncle, it helped me in my career in terms of ask very, very specific questions.
Right.
Because sometimes buyers aren't aware of what they actually want.
Yeah.
They have an
And
idea.
I find that we do that too when people are talking, and I'm like, well, how do you use this space? Because I want to understand how you use it so that I don't, just assume this is how, what you do, or because it does help to make it your own.
Exactly. And sometimes people have an idea, and well, if you know what the intent is, how they're going to use it, and I want a place to drink my morning coffee and see nature. Well, it's a good idea if that's facing east.
Right.
Because otherwise you're not going to quite have the same experience. But, people can relate that. And sometimes you find out, and I did this with a couple one time, this was the fourth transaction we had done together. So I thought I knew these people. I invited them to my wedding. They're good friends now.
Yeah.
And we were looking for their downsized home. And for the first time ever, they were fighting. And, in terms of, we were clashing about what we wanted. So this is about 4 or 5 years ago, I made up this list. We actually went out to lunch to try and figure this out. And on a notepad, I wrote, give me your priorities. So they would, work commute, the number of bedrooms, bathrooms, that kind of a thing, fireplace, and this and that. And so I said, all right. And I copied the list down and I gave it to each of them. They weren't allowed to talk about it, but I wanted them to number them 1 through 10.
Oh,
1 being the highest priority and 10 being the least. And they both gave me back the sheet. The joke about it was there were 11 items. And I've done this several times. I say, number them from 1 to 10. Even though there's 11 items on there, there were like 2 number 6s. So, like you said, people are still the same no matter what. But what was interesting is this was a common list of priorities, but they had them in a different order.
Right.
So then we sussed out, the work commute thing, and we found common ground here, here, and here. And it's the same thing whether you're doing a renovation or what type of house that you're looking at. When you find that, and for one thing, the wife wanted a fireplace. And whereas the location that we pick is very, very influential on the work commute, chances are we can add a fireplace to a home.
Right.
That's a possible thing. But in terms of buyers looking for older homes, identifying the style and gathering knowledge, attending events like the ones that I attended that you hosted, as well as the local historic preservation meetings, stuff like that. Oftentimes these are very low cost. They're free. You meet people that have more knowledge and share the excitement. And, that's where you learn. There is a lot of information out there. They don't advertise as much as Toll Brothers. And
right.
They have to go looking for it.
Right.
But in different areas, in Lancaster, where you guys operate, in Chester County, here where I live, we have historic societies that have tremendous resources about, period pictures and this and that. And, you can really learn a tremendous amount, and that influences it, because then, like you said, these older homes have an emotional connection, and defining what's important, is this buyer's emotional connection. Right.
Right. So would you use the same tips then for if you're listing an older home, would be to set expectations and to maybe, tell the story of the house?
Absolutely. In fact, today, this afternoon, I'm going to a settlement for a property that I sold that is up in Coventryville. We listed that home, and it had some challenges because it was an older home. I'm 6'1", and in the attic, which was made into a bedroom, I can only stand up at the peak of the roof.
Oh, goodness.
So, and some of the staircases are narrow and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And what was funny is, we sold the house immediately and we had a multiple offer situation because we advertised it as what it was. We did not try to make it, appeal to everyone.
Right.
It's not going to be appropriate. So we, focused on, in both the description and the marketing materials on how we're going to do that. What I encourage folks to do, even maybe before they talk to a realtor, but a realtor is often the gateway to getting an appropriate inspector, is I encourage, having a qualified home inspector that's familiar with the type of home, whether it be colonial, Victorian, or whatever, and go through the home, because more than likely your buyer is going to have a home inspection. And like I said, 15 years of doing this, even with, say, my parents' property that was built in 1990, I had my parents do a home inspection ahead of time because they've been in the house 20 years.
Just a fresh set of eyes.
Right. And it's kind of like, a good attorney never asks a question in court that he or she doesn't know the answer to.
Right.
And why would you want a buyer to know more about your house than you do or your agent does? And so that way, if you have this home inspection, it doesn't mean you have to fix everything. It does mean that you have to address it. And the best way to address it would be to get a qualified contractor or two to give you estimates. So you're framing the scope of it. The real estate agents generally don't make good estimators.
Right.
And if an agent is walking through representing the buyer looking at your home, they're not necessarily motivated to sell that buyer your home.
Right.
They're motivated to sell that buyer a home. So if there's problems, well, their inclination is to move to the next property.
Right.
Whereas if you are informing people love information. Crazy people hand out leaflets on the sidewalk and we still somehow pick them up, and we're not even interested. We'll read it oftentimes, but when you provide that information, and people that have been, they're not, they realize that likely with an older home, if you tell them that there's never anything wrong with it and it's completely perfect, well, they'll probably move on as suspect.
Right.
Because anyone that's been around the block, knows that, there's maintenance issues, and the older home is going to have, what we call character and experience. So when you're saying, here are the issues, and here's the path to solve them. One, you're complying with the state law, which is disclosure.
Right.
And also, you're putting yourself at a competitive advantage because, you have to properly disclose, but also the buyer is able to see what they're buying more fully.
Right. And there's not surprises during that process. Yeah.
And, the process is that for the buyer to have a home inspection, you've already agreed on a price.
Right.
So if we agreed on this, particular home price of $300,000, and then we find out that it needs $20,000 worth of work, unless it's an unbelievably overheated, intense market,
right,
that buyer doesn't want to pay $300 anymore.
Right.
They want you as the seller to participate, and then you're working on their schedule of the contract dates. So being able to get a contractor that will give you, an accurate estimate. Of course, the buyer is always going to err on the high side, and as a seller, you want to minimize that. So by having that home inspection done by a qualified inspector that understands old homes, and again, working with an agent that has the resources to know someone like you, or the tradespeople that can take care of this appropriately, at least to get an estimate, if not. And sometimes there's not money to do to do the work. Right. But there's equity in the home so that you can say, this will be paid for at settlement. There's ways to bridge that gap. Yeah. And buyers are much more relaxed at that point in terms of, hey, this is an honest transaction. There's some issues with this house, but there is a path forward rather than the unknown. No one wants, the unknown when making a several $100,000 purchase. Oh yeah. And it is a big purchase, and it's scary. I'm sure that there's a lot of hand holding. and that's exactly the time, the X and Y meet from buyer's remorse. Buyer's remorse shows up the morning of the home inspection before it even begins. So, so again, but as a seller, I want to be able to give my seller clients the best position to negotiate from. And that's a position of knowledge and strength, in that they take control of the situation by knowing what issues may come up. We've found a way around them, and you're putting it out there, because that way all the buyers that aren't interested in that, they self-eliminate.
Right. You don't even have to spend time showing the house and things to them.
Right. Yeah. No one in the past 15 years hired me to almost go to sell.
Right.
We've all had enough practice signing our name on contracts. No one wants to do this as practice. They want a result. They want to be able, like I said, we get there in an intersection where people are moving on, literally and emotionally or whatever, and they want it done. This is the best way to do that. The other thing is that a lot of older homes, people do have history about it.
Yes.
And the home in Coventryville passed on through 3 or 4 different owners. I have a 3-inch thick 3-ring binder of all kinds of stuff about the local area. Even my own home had maps and stuff. One of the neat things that I got with my home was a pen and ink drawing done in 1952 by a local artist who happened to live down the road. And he was an amateur artist and an architect. And during World War II, he had been employed by the Parks Commission in Philadelphia to make drawings of prominent local historic, his name was Fletcher McNeil, and he did all of these drawings, both pen and ink and architectural style, in a proactive effort, in that if any of these things, if we were experiencing bombing like the British had or something like that, they would want to take out symbolic targets like Independence Hall. And so he was doing drawings at Valley Forge and all kinds of stuff. Because he lived around the corner, it just so happened, maybe he knew the farmer or whatever, he made this sketch. Well, that's
that's invaluable. Yeah,
exactly. It's as much as I am a numbers guy, as a realtor, when I do investment rental real estate or investment flip real estate or something like that, this is my own home. This is my own experience, and I get a little bit romantic about it.
Yes.
And, I overlooked the overwhelming amount of bamboo that's on this property, partly because I was still thinking about that history of the home.
Yes.
The carving in the step, the pen and ink painting from 60 years ago, like all part of that history, and that's that's what makes your home as an historic home interesting. And also, don't be afraid to show the people the receipts and upgrades that you've made.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Everyone wants to talk about how expensive it is, to do work on a historic home. And yes, like I said, I can usually show where you can offset the cost elsewhere. However, but that's important to reveal too, because if the buyer is looking at older homes and they're between home A and home B, and all of a sudden you see, oh, well, this had a new roof done and it was $21,000 because, we complied with, it's a cedar roof rather than asphalt shingle or something like that. Well, that's going to add value because the other home might need a roof.
Right. And that's $21,000 you don't have to spend.
Right. Or it was done, with a less authentic material. And, did that owner, because they had a budget, did they disregard other valuable core elements of what makes a property, historic, and maintaining that? Not, like we mentioned before, Home Depot or Lowe's remodels start to erase some of that historic character.
They do, yeah.
And that's where it starts to slide from being historic to just old.
That's very true.
Historic implies that there's a special value to it, and I've learned that more and more as I serve on the West Whiteland Township Historical Commission. And, sometimes, we're all interested in preserving and the adaptive reuse of our historic properties. Unfortunately, sometimes they've been in continual use, and they've been altered so many times over the years that it might not be financially feasible, or sometimes too much of it has been damaged to bring back. And where do you go from there? Kind of a thing. So we try to encourage people. Let's keep the 6x6, fenestration in the glass. Please please consider using a traditional door sourced from a salvaged home rather than the fiberglass or steel, Lowe's special that's on sale this week.
Right.
Because once you take apart some of those elements, you are, in my opinion, and I'm trying to work with someone at the National Association of Realtors and the Pennsylvania Historic Conservation Network to come up with numbers to say, listen, when you do that, you're devaluing it. And I sometimes make the analogy, to cars. And if we had, a 57 Chevy, it's a car that people can sort of buy into,
right?
In terms of everyone knows what it looks like. So it's a very classic 50s car. Well, if we put a modern CD player in the middle of the dashboard, it functions and everything, but it looks completely out of place. Well, it's the same thing when we do that to a historic home.
No, and I agree. And I think too, some of the things that we deal with that I'm sure is part of what you're working on is that understanding of how buildings work and how that building science of it doesn't really make sense to replace your windows first to save energy, because that's not where your air is escaping from. It's escaping from the roof. And, those kind of things where I don't know if it was before we started recording or not, but you were talking about, the modern approaches oftentimes will, they have that marketing budget, where the educational component of how an older home works doesn't have that marketing budget behind it. So it's educating small groups of people little by little, rather than, having a TV campaign.
Well, and I have made it available, but I learned it at your seminar about the University of Vermont study.
Yes.
On older wood windows. And I make that available to people and say, okay, they run commercials on any channel, if
several times during the newscast.
Right. If you sit on your couch for an hour and a half, you're guaranteed to see, some window company, and over the phone, they will practically quote you and have you apply for financing and all this other stuff. Whereas, there's the lobby for redoing historic sash windows isn't quite, it's got that ad budget.
Right.
And on the other side of things, like you said, it's, whenever I ask my clients, either in preparation to sell a home or, in advising them in, future upgrades, if you spend $1, you want to get that dollar back as much as possible in terms of value. And oftentimes what I've seen is with replacement windows, you've devalued the aesthetic of the home, and the performance often isn't that great, especially when they are not wood core. They go to the straight vinyl. Those are 10 to 15-year windows. Yeah.
But they're really cheap. You can just keep buying them.
Right.
Well, and part of what I've heard too, and you could probably speak to this from a real estate standpoint, is that people put them in right before they sell, right before they're getting ready to sell. And then people live in houses generally about 7 years. And so then they're not having to replace them again. The next person replaces them.
Correct.
Yeah.
And with a lot of things, we have moved to either planned obsolescence or, disposable use society.
Right.
And I kind of laugh. One of the reasons I bought this house is because it had wavy glass panes.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
That was the intrinsic value. And one of the projects that I did on my own home that has helped me professionally was like I said, I would make the joke that we were catching up on 200 years of deferred maintenance. And we needed to replace an oil boiler that was, 50 plus years old.
Right.
So it was inefficient and needed to go. And the way my properties, even though my neighbors have gas, I wasn't able to efficiently get natural gas. So I looked into other alternatives. And a few years back, there was a tax credit for doing geothermal.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's what we did. In that process, it was a, great process that way, but we were able to remove radiators.
Yes.
And so, had been added much later from the house.
Yeah, because there wasn't central heating when your house was built.
Correct. So one of the things was interesting. We added ductwork, and we tried to do it very discreetly. And I'm actually having a tradesperson do raised panel woodwork to enclose it so it looks like the mirroring staircase.
Oh, yeah.
So part of the project was to, improve that. But also, we were sort of taking it back in many aspects. By removing the cast iron radiators, we were creating spaces that hadn't been available for 130 years.
Right.
But the most important, and if I look at all the different things that we did, the geothermal was great. But in order to say, use our attic space rather than insulate in between, the second floor and the attic,
right.
We decided to insulate the attic itself and make that potentially livable space. And the $3,500 I spent in insulating the attic, within an hour after they left, I had to lower the thermostat.
Oh, I can believe it, because and that's building science. That's like basic building science, and the walls are negative plane. So when they say that you're going to save 50% of the heating loss through your windows, that's 10%. So you're saving 5%. So you're never going to get the cost of the windows back from heating. But if you insulate the attic, you definitely will.
Well, I think I might have an advantage in describing this, because I just point to my head, and I'm bald. And so when it's cold, I'm cold.
Right.
So the first thing you do is you put a wool hat on in the wintertime, and you're good. Yeah. And that's exactly what we did for the house. And that's where you get the best return for the dollar. And the side benefit is not only cheaper, it's significantly more effective, it's less invasive, and you keep the aesthetic, the integrity of the home.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not as exciting. But exciting isn't good. Car crashes are exciting.
Right. Well, and you can't keep selling people insulation over and over again. And from a mass production consumerism standpoint, that doesn't help.
Correct. So therefore the insulation lobby, again, they host boring events. You have to bring your own food and alcohol. So.
Oh, goodness. So do you have any tips for people to look for in a real estate agent, like things that you would recommend people to understand when they're looking for a realtor?
Absolutely. There's a couple different classifications. The National Association of Realtors gets all excited when we say that being a realtor means that you're a member of the association.
Okay.
Generally, that's more focused on residential, although we do have commercial members. So anyone could be an agent or a realtor, and focus on many, many different things. I've got a good friend that focuses almost 100% on foreclosed properties, and short sales. So there's several niches. Yeah. And he's so good at that I've had challenging deals, and I've actually referred them to him, because you know what? It's more that client is going to get better service from him than I'm going to be able to do. You don't want a podiatrist to do brain surgery. They're both doctors. They're probably both excellent. But make sure that the agent that you get is familiar with what you're trying to do. So someone who is phenomenal with, is the top seller in your area or this or that. If you're looking at buying something that's a potential investment or rental property or multi-unit, that may be completely out of their depth. Not a disservice to them or whatever. And so you're sort of, sometimes I make references back to cars. If we need to carry plywood, you probably shouldn't buy a Mini Cooper,
Right.
Or buy the Mini Cooper and rent an F-150.
Right.
But if you're carrying plywood every day, like let's get the tool to do the job. And I would say doing that with the realtor is important, that aspect. And the second thing is make sure it's a good fit. Oftentimes it seems that, and it doesn't help with like shows like that are on HGTV, where it positions the realtor as sort of the star of the show, and
Right.
they're showing the client, 3 homes and make a decision out of these 3. Sorry. I don't want to show endless homes, but I want to use people's time correctly. And I believe in my buyer's contract and my listing contract when working with sellers, both of them, it states quite plainly that I work for them. They are hiring an agent.
Right.
So I'm an independent contractor, but I'm their employee. It's got to be a good fit. And we have, as realtors, a fiduciary responsibility. And that means we must act in the client's interest over our own. And that's very, very important to me that, from an ethics standpoint, that people understand that, I'm not going to try to sell you on the home that's more expensive or pays a higher commission. We want to make sure that we're getting the home that meets your needs.
Right.
And not only in the price, but in the structure of the deal, and how it comes about. And is this a good fit for you? But you have to know that it's a good fit, agent-wise. Are they going to be able to help you by setting the correct expectations and working through the process?
Yeah. Okay. And then are there anything that I know you've been in real estate for 15 years. Was there anything that you wish you knew when you started that you've learned or that you know now?
Yeah, everything.
Public confession time.
Yes. One of the things I like about this business is everyone is just a little bit different, thankfully. And every house, even though it might be on the same block,
Right.
same style, same built in the same year by the same builder, every house is a little bit different because we've all had these different experiences. And so that means that, every day I learn something new that going forward I can use to help my clients, both past and present, make a good decision.
Yeah.
And so it's the collective experience.
I agree with that in my world too, because there's sometimes that you see a solution on a project that you're like, oh, that would have worked then. Not that what you did didn't work, but this is just a little bit of a better or a different approach.
Sure, exactly.
Yeah.
Different set of eyes, a different different set of circumstances, and possibly when you're looking at again with some of those HGTV shows, there's the one where the guy just comes in and no matter what happens, he just rips on whatever contractor was there before. And
Right.
I've been showing homes where people say, oh, this was done. I said, well, but you don't know, how did this contractor find it? What was the budget constraint? The time
Right.
constraint?
Yeah.
They weren't necessarily bad tradesmen. It was just that
This was the goal.
right. Yeah. We have $700 to do a $1,000 job.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I try not to go through and complain or, say, oh, this was terrible. And recently we were called out in the past 6 weeks or so to figure out why a roof was leaking. And the roof was redone maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Jonathan got up on the roof. We're trying to figure it out. Here, it was completely done wrong. Like the flashing was done wrong. They left the old flashing. They had the drip edge behind the gutters. Everything that they could have done wrong, they did wrong. and I'm like,
short of drilling a hole and draining it directly into the house.
Yes, that's exactly what was happening. I said, this is a time I can't be diplomatic.
Right. And it's the same thing, when looking for a contractor as a realtor. We're both vendors providing a service. Is their skill set and knowledge, appropriate for this job?
Right.
I mean, I've got contractors that are fantastic at doing this type work.
Yeah.
I've got a contractor that does primarily kitchens and bathrooms and flooring. He will not paint. He will not do, anything like that. And because he says, I'm not good at, this is where my specialty is. And I love that directness because I know
And you know
and
your
he
limits.
knows where he's profitable, and he knows where he's successful, and he can do the best work.
Yeah.
I know a painter. She's got a crew in Delaware County. She's absolutely amazing, but excuse me. Oftentimes, people want her to start doing, not prep work for painting. We're getting into sheetrock work and stuff like that, and she's like, "No, I can tell you 3 people that will do it, but I don't do that because we want to get in and out and paint as quickly as possible." And with the best quality work. And so I think that's important. Sometimes the person that does everything, they just don't do any of it well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes people don't know their limits, and that's when they're really scary.
One thing I did want to touch on, as a realtor, I'm on one side, and then on the other side, being not only a historic homeowner, but on the historic commission, is there is a lot of bad information, and unfortunately some of it is spread by agents in terms of telling people to avoid a house that's on the National Historic Register, or is part of a historic preservation community or neighborhood. And this information is almost always available on that specific community or township website. Or you can call the township and find out exactly. Now, the agent, in my opinion, should be doing this, or at least supplying the potential buyer, or even I've encountered people that know that they have an old home, but had no idea that they were in a historic area, a district. And so then all of a sudden people say, "Oh, well, you can't change anything with that house." No, that's not true.
That's not true. Right.
This isn't Elfrist Alley. Yeah, okay. And find out what those rules are. Now, certainly before buying, and there you may find some big advantages in certain older properties, because before there were codes or before zoning changes, there may be some very favorable items grandfathered in. Because they were done before. For instance, I live in a very residential neighborhood, but since my house was once a farmhouse, and I have 2 stables on the property, I could have horses and some animals if I wanted.
Right.
Chickens. Whereas my neighbor
can't. Right. Yeah.
So they're, again, going back to asking clients questions and stuff like that. This is the next step, is that I believe, I do this for my clients and try to find, some of those information, but to, again, accurately portray that. And the next thing goes to something that, you've done work for insurance companies and stuff like that. Historic homes, you should have a proper home owner's insurance valuation inspection. The cost of replacement is oftentimes more than what, slap and dash plywood or we don't see plywood anymore. We see OSB at best, construction, and so we can't use that, cost of square foot sort of thing on that. You want to make sure that you're properly insured.
Yeah, for replacement versus just repair.
It might be more expensive, but for instance, having that evaluation, for instance, when I went from an oil furnace to the geothermal, my rates went down.
Okay.
There's significantly less risk of a fire.
Oh yeah.
In that, there's we're never going to have an oil leak in our basement or from our tank.
And so you don't have that environmental exposure either.
Sure. So and that was something that I was shocked about myself. But hey, point it out. And you want to be properly compensated for the home in the event that there's damage. After a while, as you get older, you realize you've paid into insurance for a long, long time.
Right.
And more often than not, the way it works is that we pay more than we'll ever get back.
Right.
You just want to make sure that
not that it feels good, but then you've never had anything major happen.
Correct. That's why we pay it, and I'll keep paying it. But I want to make sure that we're just like any consumer would want to be, content in knowing that they're getting what they paid for, and that's appropriate.
Yeah, I agree. Is there anything else that you can think of that you wanted to share?
I think it's great. What I'm starting to see is a shift towards some neighborhoods and maybe houses that weren't. Not every old house is going to be Downton Abbey,
Right.
Or spectacular. Don't try to make it something that it isn't. But what I have seen is a lot of younger buyers are appreciating stuff that's authentic. Which is really, heartwarming for me that value some of the history, but they they're seeming to prefer the authentic character and construction rather than gross square footage.
Right.
So maybe that older craftsman home, that mid-century home, or even a Victorian era
like row house or
brick row home, okay, it's got smaller windows and on the facade and slightly smaller rooms. But once you step inside, you can, if you're creative and you've done research, you can really connect the two times by doing some innovative. And the neat thing about these houses are, if you were looking at a 10-year-old house that you wanted to knock down the wall and open up, I would say probably 10 years old, where they had the, we see it all the time with the colonial floor plan that is mimicking, sort of the partition walls of a formal dining room, formal living room. Well, people aren't living that way anymore. So we're seeing those disappear. Well, if you're working with a 10-year-old home that has engineered flooring, well, you have to replace the entire floor because you're not going to be able to match that.
No.
You can't refinish it in most cases. So that's why I kind of laugh and they say, oh, well, old homes are more expensive. No, I've got 200-year-old floors that are 1 3/4 inches thick.
Yeah, they're not going to wear out. You could sand them a lot.
Right. I can sand them every other year until I'm, carried out of this thing feet first, and I'm still not going to make a dent in this. So, okay, now not every old house has that, but even if you have, the very familiar, turn of the century, oak strip flooring.
Yeah.
Well, you've done it a million times where you've moved a wall or done something, and you can sand that and you can feather that in to the point where you have to be looking for it with a very, very trained eye. And oftentimes, you can get away with making it blend in, or you can innovate something that it becomes a patchwork of the character. And it's a timestamp of, this is when we, did this, and it's cool, not hokey.
Right.
But oftentimes in newer homes, you cannot do that because
the materials are definitely not forgiving.
Right. And so, that's where I sit there and say, I looked at a house Saturday morning with a client where it had a vinyl floor, and this was a 1,500 square foot, townhouse. Yeah. In the first floor alone, it had carpet, vinyl, a tile entry, and 2 different types of hardwood.
Oh, goodness.
And, and unfortunately, about half of it was new. And I said, my advice to this person would have been redo everything continuously with one, even if it's a laminate floor. The quality of those is actually pretty good now. Yeah,
they're getting better.
Right. And you could have a contiguous space where it's going to make it flow a lot better and feel much like a larger space because you don't have this limit. Whereas with an older home, you can buy salvage materials. You can, there's so many great things, and that's almost a hobby in itself. And doing these things to your house. And I think, it's a way to personalize it. It's a way to do it. I guess I'm kind of a goofball in the sense that most kids played video games growing up. I didn't collect comic books. I read Auto Trader and Hot Rod Magazine when I was like 7. But one of my favorite shows on TV was This Old House.
Yes. Yeah.
Kind of thing, because I just thought it was now. Full disclosure, my parents restored a 1920s era colonial house, which was built on the site of an original farmhouse. So just like my house now, it had probably 18-inch thick stone walls.
Oh, yeah.
And had been adapted. We actually think it was a barn that had been converted to a house because the chimneys were done later, kind of a thing, looking back at it. But that was very, very interesting from that colonial revival period, the architect was pretty prominent, and it was a subdivision in the 30s, right before the 20s and the 30s, right before the Depression.
Uh-huh.
And I just kind of laughed as I got into real estate when they would be talking about these new homes and the millwork and quality of construction.
Oh, goodness.
Like, where is it? I grew up in a neighborhood where they had inlaid and parquet floors and all kinds of stuff that it was just, built-ins and stuff like that. And so I value that. I think it's fantastic. And I love that we're starting to see some younger buyers value that again, rather than they're looking for individuality and uniqueness, rather than I want to have 4,000 square feet on a third of an acre, and I want it to look massive and have all kinds of space that I'm never going to use.
Right. Well, and I was going to ask you that. Do you think it's kind of a backlash from the McMansions?
I do. I mean, in generally, some of the larger square foot homes that were popular, 15 to 20 years ago, it's kind of funny. Some of them are painful for people because that was just when I was getting started in real estate. And I remember I worked with a buyer that I met off the internet, and this was a single guy. He was making about $50,000 a year, and an internet bank that he had contacted had approved him for $400,000.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm trying to figure out, this does not make any sense. Well, sure, if you did an interest only loan, it would work.
Yeah.
And I said, but I tried to explain to him, I said, okay, with an interest only loan, you have the pride of ownership, but you're really renting the house. You get to maintain it, you get to pay the taxes and everything, but you're not achieving
paying down the mortgage. Yeah.
And so, and that was that whole loan was actually a very, very specified product that it wasn't intended to be used by so many people. So a lot of people in that era in 2004, 5, 6, bought these big homes because they could, not because they should. And it caused a lot of pain, and so I think that's part of it. And people realized, well, one of the features I would see is that you would walk into these master bedrooms and they would have this sitting room before it, or they would have a bathroom that was 500 square feet.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
What are you doing in there? And so all this space. And what I found personally is that the more space we have, the more junk we collect.
Right.
And the further away that we get from the stuff that is actually meaningful. So the less stuff we have, we tend to value it more. And that's just I guess philosophy type thing. But what we're seeing is the home buyers now, or the kids that the millennial generation, or the youngest home buyers that are buying starter homes now, they were the ones that were in high school and college through that.
Right.
So they saw the financial and housing market distress through a very specific lens, and they're opting in and saying, we don't want that.
Right.
We don't want gross consumerism. We're looking, for something. That's why communities are being gentrified, in the sense that if you have walkability to a park, to shopping, to restaurants, those homes are going to sell well, and that's a key element, that we identify with buyers. And then also, if you're a seller and your house has that, know that, publicize and exploit that. That this is part of the experience.
Highlight it. Yeah. Okay, very good. And I know you said you serve Delaware and Chester County in Pennsylvania. Are there? How can our listeners contact you?
My bat signal, it isn't working well right now. But easiest way is text or call on the phone. Area code 610-637-8598, or joe@joemccormick.net. It always seems that my website, linked with my broker, or the national affiliation of RE/MAX, seems to always be under construction. And by the time I get it the way I want it, it's like time to update it again. And I've been meaning to do some different stuff. I'm inspired by your podcast and stuff
thank you.
To get a little bit more active with sharing some of that stuff. even some of the stuff that I'm doing with my own house. And I recently made the acquaintance of a local guy who I believe has done a good amount to help inject some energy into older houses. Jeff Devlin, who had the show Stonehouse Revival. And Jeff's a neat guy in that he is actually opened a new business here in Exton, at the Exton Mall, of all places, that specializes in teaching people how to do traditional woodworking methods. He's got a full modern wood shop, but he'll take you, with a drawing knife and teach you how to hand hewn stuff and do, mortise and tenon joints with a combination of modern tools and old chisels and stuff like that, which I think is really cool because, he and I are talking about doing some different stuff where encouraging owners of older homes to be able to take classes with them to say, oh, I want to duplicate a piece of trim rather than using that Home Depot stock.
Yeah. And if it's a small enough piece, you can do it by hand. I mean, you couldn't do a whole house by hand would be really
exactly.
It wouldn't be reasonable. But yeah, when there's a small piece that just needs to be replicated, Jonathan will oftentimes just, cut that stock and then, carve it, because you can do that faster than setting up all the tools and the bits and the knives and everything else that you need.
Yeah. And so Jeff's great that way of saying, providing people a gateway to do it. And, there's been a couple lately. Borough of Westchester hosted one, and I think there's another one coming up in the Pennsylvania Historic Preservation Network about, educating people and giving them a hands-on on repairing, wood sash windows, whether they're weighted or not, which I think is great because people are going to attend that. And just like you said, if it's a small piece or if it's one window, a homeowner will tackle that themselves.
Yeah.
When it's beyond that, they're not necessarily going to, want to take on, it's like a full-time job doing it. But at least they have the appreciation for what's involved, and they will be able to identify good contractors like you guys that understand they're not doing this for the first time.
Yeah. And we had a woman who was like, she watched Jonathan hang a door, and sometimes hanging a door is a process. So you have to take it on and off and on and off to get it fit in right. And she's like, I never realized how much work went into fitting a door. She's like, I appreciate what you do now so much more than I did. I didn't realize, all the work that went into it.
Right. And
I do think that people understand then once they can see it. And also some of that like lower skill stuff like window restoration, not that window restoration is low skill, but there's a lot of paint stripping and different things like that if a homeowner can do that, it saves a lot of money, and then you can put your money towards something else that needs higher skill.
Right, exactly. And when you guys come on a job, I'm sure that you're looking to an estimate. You're like, okay, can I present it? So if you do this work and I do this work,
we sometimes do, because I have done my fair share of paint stripping, but if you have, especially if it's summertime, we'll say if you can get a college kid to come in, you can watch them, make sure they're careful. This can be their summer job, and then we can come in and do the repairs.
Exactly. And I mean, that's a great thing to do, because people sometimes don't understand the level of craftsmanship and the experience that enables someone to bill, at $150 an hour because they're, craftsmen, know. Well, it's inefficient to have them, working on scraping a window.
Right. Yeah.
And so and that's one of the things where I try to, sort of going back to setting the expectations when people say, oh, older homes are more expensive. Right. But that's because you're approaching the job from a different angle, not, a restore rather than remove and replace, which once you do that, my windows are 200 years old. They haven't been touched before. So if I do all this work that you're describing, some of it myself and pay, for the technical aspect to be done, well, likely they're going to be good for another 200 years.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
That's a great investment.
It is. And with a little bit of maintenance, making sure they're painted and sealed, they will last another 200 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
And actually with the old wood, even not maintaining sometimes, as long as the wood can dry out, I mean, eventually it'll catch up with you, but you have a little bit more time.
Well, exactly. As long, and usually, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because usually the problems with older homes, I point out, are oftentimes caused by other subsequent owners or things. And one of the things I point out too is, like, when we go into a house and you see that someone in the 70s insulated it, and they over insulated it and don't allow the house to breathe or breathe properly.
Yeah, we were in a house on Saturday that had that problem.
Right, and then all of a sudden you've got rot in the soffits that shouldn't be there and stuff like that. All kinds of weird little, issues. Or going back to some of the siding, they had wood clapboard siding, and then they put vinyl or aluminum over it. Yeah. And so with the wood, it was a breathable element. So if it got wet, even internally, it could dry out eventually. Slowly. But once you put that covering on it, you've sealed it much more.
Yeah, you're trapped.
Right, and exactly. And it's funny because cars are also my hobby, and the same parallels happened. They would take old cars and they would rust proof them by putting this undercoating on the bottom.
Oh.
Well, you just covered up all the drain holes that were put there. So we call it an M&M. It looks like it's a thin candy shell.
Oh yeah.
That's deteriorating from the inside out, and when you see that first little hole, it's all over.
Right. That's my big thing with internal gutters in the mostly Victorian houses.
Right.
That once you start seeing the water come through, the damage has been done. So that's like one of those constant maintenance things,
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming on. I learned a lot. I'm glad that you were able to share your knowledge with our listeners. You told us where to find you, and where you serve. Is there anything else you want to share before we're done for the morning?
Please, people, educate yourselves. When Danielle hosts a seminar, attend it, because it's the last one in Lancaster was fantastic. A tour of the James Buchanan House was an added bonus.
Yes.
And you learn a lot, and certainly worth the time and every dollar that you would pay. But education is fantastic. You always learn something, and like I said, attending local historical commission or group meetings, and even volunteering to serve on those boards. It gives you a special appreciation for how zoning happens, the good and the bad, and you're at least giving your voice to your community, and that's important. A lot of there's a quote that's been attributed to a bunch of different people, but it's the only thing you need for evil to flourish is good. People do nothing.
Right.
I appropriated that for zoning. The only thing for evil, bad construction to happen is for good people to say nothing.
Right.
to not participate.
Yeah.
And so that's what enables historically viable properties to be torn down when they should be saved.
Right.
Because people didn't take the time to get involved, whether through social media or through things. Let's preserve our history. And I grew up in Delaware County and work in Chester County, and there is a pretty significant difference between the amount of and focus of preservation between the two, not only in historic properties, but open space. And it's a shame to see old stuff right now, right along the Franklin Mint property on Route 1. Some historic homes were torn down, and they could have been saved. They could have been valuable, resources.
Right. Yeah. And I do tell people too that, like, if you want to ensure preservation happens in your community, it's all done at the local level. The demolition is approved at local level, all of those things. So if you can work within your community to then write your zoning, or work to when those reviews are being done, to say at least there needs to be a review of a process for demolition, or things like that's the way to really impact, because it's all done at the local township municipal level.
And historic preservation is extremely green. You know?
It is. It is. That is very
if,
true.
if you look at what
Yeah.
the energy would be to tear down this old stone house, and then, even though these rocks came from the earth, then it'd be fill
Right.
somewhere. The amount that it would take to rebuild something
Yeah.
of its size, is a huge carbon footprint, where we can not only have something that's aesthetically pleasing and historically relevant, it can also provide good for the planet. Because you're never going to be able to get old growth wood like that's in these homes.
No, that is very true. Yeah.
That is reworkable, refinishable. It's I believe that's important too, and we should know where we came from.
Yeah, I agree. Well, thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the Practical Preservation Podcast. The resources discussed during this episode are on our website at practicalpreservationservices.com/podcast. If you received value from this episode and know someone else that will get value from it as well, please share it with them. Join us next week for another episode of the Practical Preservation Podcast. For more information on restoring your historic home, visit practicalpreservationservices.com.